Honestly, I don't take a dev tools product seriously if it's not open source.
Really?
In 2024, yeah.
More and more people are launching open source dev tools, but for me at least, licensing is still very confusing. So I invited Eric and Matt, who are the founders of Trigger.dev and know more about open source licensing than any other DevTools founders that I've met.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's the book there. It's pretty thick.
Show it sideways to see how thick it is.
And that's where I'm at.
And in this episode, they share what you actually need to know as a founder about open source licensing. It's a good one.
That's probably the worst decision you could make.
Yeah.
Is choose like a weird license, especially as you start to think about like bigger companies.
We would love if people self-hosted us.
Even if you weren't getting paid for that.
Everyone has quite a strong opinion, and also they disagree like a lot.
Something that we were talking about at the pub, well, Matt and I were talking about at the pub, was kind of open source licensing. Mm-hmm. And, I think this is especially on topic right now with what's going on with WordPress. It's kind of taken over everyone's like Twitter feeds. But plus the cursor, the VS Code continue fork. Yeah. And so there is a bit of like kind of, stuff. But I know it's something that you guys have looked into a lot. And also I think that, of the teams I've met, I think you're among the most like passionate about open source, and like you really want to like do it right, and also like build a startup, but like be like a good kind of internet citizen. And I know that, I kind of wanted to hear how you've been thinking about it and what you've learned about licensing.
There are also, so all of that stuff is totally true. And I guess we wanted to make Trigger open source and very like open source. So MIT is like the most permissive license you can have, where basically you can do whatever you want with it. And then I'd say Apache 2 is like the next most permissive, and it just adds trademark basically. Mm-hmm. But I guess the reason we caught this bug was we built another open source project called JSON Hero, which is like completely, is that even MIT?
That's MIT.
It's MIT. And that did really well. And we have a hosted version. But that was like so exciting and fun. That's what basically got us really into it, I think. Yeah,
because I mean, I've worked on mostly closed source stuff for my career, even though even when I was doing like Code School, that was like a developer education platform. That was all like closed source and stuff. Obviously, I was using and teaching open source stuff, but I think when we did the JSON Hero thing and saw the reception and started the issues coming in and the pull requests and stuff, and it was just why wouldn't we do, if we're doing anything for developers, like why wouldn't you do it open source? It makes so much more sense.
I feel like, honestly, I don't take a dev tools product seriously if it's not open source.
Really?
In 2024, yeah.
Why?
I mean, I will always look for an open source alternative if there is like a closed source product that we use. It does kind of depend on the product though. So like if you're building like an observability product, like logs or something, then I don't think being open source is essential. But if you're something which is like part of because for logs, you're kind of sending the log somewhere, and then you look at them in like a third-party product. Sentry is open source, but if you're looking at them, in some other product, it doesn't matter so much. But if that thing is part of your tech stack, then like I really want it to be open source.
Well, also because we are open source.
Wow, we kind of have to do it.
You can't like go and sign a commercial agreement and then put some commercial license in your open source project.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. I mean, we can, like, there is definitely the rise of costs that were, say like a cal.com or someone like that, where they will use like in their open, like to set up their, like to self-host it, you might have to sign up for some proprietary services or something. But we try, I don't think we have anything like that. And then we've always, like for example, we could go and build a feature that like, oh, you have to go sign up for Cloudflare, or like this feature doesn't work or something, because we're using, Cloudflare workers. So we try not to build anything like that in the open source repo. So it's like it's nothing that is like some separate sort of feature thing that requires some proprietary license.
Yeah, we're trying to stay as cloud agnostic as we possibly can, which is mostly about self-hosters really, but also with an eye to enterprise, because in our case, because we're running user code, most enterprises are going to want to deploy that in their own cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And if you suddenly have a dependency on, let's say, Cloudflare, then that enterprise has got to be happy with using Cloudflare. So it's both better for self-hosters, but it's also better for like thinking about enterprise and stuff like that. But we're very, very careful about what dependencies we use. Definitely, there are many features that would have been a lot easier to build if we had just used some like off-the-shelf proprietary software, and instead, like we'll use something like Redis or.
Well, the non.
I mean, Redis is actually a great licensing.
The actual open source.
Yeah,
Redis
the open
version,
source
yeah.
Redis.
They changed it back though, didn't they? Or
Did they? No, I don't think they changed it back.
Okay.
There is like a Valkey that's like an alternative to Redis. That's like an open source fork from, the previous version of Redis that had the permissive license.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, a good example of this is we're building this feature right now we call like real time, and it's basically allows you to get updates about what's happening in your background job, on your server or live to your like front end. So you can sort of build experiences where like, you can do stuff in your background jobs and then show them to your users. And so for a little bit, we were thinking of using Cloudflare workers and durable objects just from like, then we don't have to like, do a bunch of stuff. And maybe we're like, oh, maybe that's like cloud only. Maybe we'll be able to build this, like if you're self-hosting, you don't get real time, and maybe that's like a cloud only feature. But then I don't know if you've seen this project, the Electric SQL.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think they're British. James is.
Yeah, half the team is, I think.
Yeah.
From here, and we saw that come out. We're like, oh, this is perfect. So we actually built the feature with Electric, and so that's
cool.
a permissive open source license, so that we can just ship it ourselves. And then if you want to self-host that as well, then you can have the feature for the self-hosted version. So we always prefer like that, going that route.
Definitely.
And it was good that we sort of like, we almost like delayed it, and then it was like perfect like timing because they came out with Electric, and we're like, oh, this is.
Yeah, we got lucky with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't go down the route of building it like halfway with Cloudflare, but.
Yeah. That's wicked.
Yeah.
That's wicked.
This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. At some point, you're going to land a big customer and they're going to ask you for enterprise features. That's where WorkOS comes in, because they give you these features out the box. Features like skim provisioning, SAML authentication, and audit logs. They have an easy-to-use API, and they're trusted by big dev tools like Vercel, as well as smaller, fast-growing dev tools like Knock. So if you're looking to cross the enterprise chasm and make yourself enterprise ready, check out WorkOS. We've also done an episode with Michael, the founder of WorkOS, where he shares a lot of tips around crossing the enterprise chasm, landing your first enterprise deals, and making sure that you're ready for them. Thanks, WorkOS, for sponsoring the podcast, and back to the show.
Okay, and then so like there are challenges with open source as well, though, right? And I think so to bring it to an analogy, I know that I was talking to you guys about like pricing, and it's like I think initially your pricing was like extremely like one line or something. It's just like one thing. And then like every line of the pricing is because someone kind of started to like abuse, like doing things that were just like completely outrageous. And then you had to be like, okay, like you have this, you can't quite do this or something. Sending like a trillion, requests in like, whatever. And I feel like with open source as well, it's like a lot of the license considerations are like, if, AWS come along and build a competing or someone forks you and just does like sells your product as their own and stuff like that.
Yeah. I guess we like to think about, there's so many ways of slicing this, and it's amazing how when you speak to other like commercial open source companies, everyone has quite a strong opinion, and also they disagree like a lot. So occasionally we'll get people asking us for like advice on what license to choose, and they'll ask other people, and everyone disagrees. But the way that I like to think about it is there's kind of different things you can like protect against by choosing your license. Now, if you're MIT or Apache 2, you're basically saying like everything is pretty much fair game. If you choose like a less permissive license than that, you're kind of either choosing it because you want to protect against competitors. So I think the classic examples of that are database companies. So if you're MongoDB, if you're Elastic, Redis obviously now, AWS and Google and Azure are really, really, really good at like hosting and like delivering products, and enterprises already have agreements with them.
Yeah.
And so they'll just take your software and just like make it available to people and do it really well. So like if you're in that boat, then like you should think really hard about your license. I think we're a lot less worried about that personally for us. We're less worried about competitors. Open core is another one, which is where you have, generally the way you implement open core is you have like a mixed license on your repo, and you have, most of the repo is permissive like MIT or Apache 2. And then some folders, usually they're called EE folders, are under a different license, where basically like you have to pay for like a commercial license for it.
And that's protecting not against competitors necessarily, but more about are enterprises going to self-host and run you at like scale and never pay anything or give anything back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the protection that people with those type of licenses are looking for. And it's interesting how, which types of projects choose that or not. I think for something like us where, we're it's not a database. We're not a database, but we're kind of more on that side of things. Like more like if you were using us at scale, it'd be like quite a critical piece of infrastructure. It's basically like a compute layer, right? So I think with that, you sort of, the protection against enterprise running you without, paying you anything is a little bit less of a worry, because we know that, or we suspect that enterprises, when they get to using us at scale, will want like our like operational expertise in running it, and so they'll come to us for like some kind of agreement, whether that's using our cloud or doing an on-prem thing with them, and maybe they have like a bunch of different instances that are scattered around their org, and they want to like unify them, and they want to come to us for helping with that. And so I think it depends on if like, is it possible? Is it how mission critical is the thing they're using you for? And like, can they kind of use you without ever, in that middle area of like, you're kind of mission critical, but not really. They might be able to just use it and never do anything back if you don't have that protection.
And also you made the other point, which is how easy is it to like deploy and manage and run and scale?
Yeah.
Those are the two like critical things, I think.
Yeah. So for something like, I keep bringing up Cal.com, but they're like a huge sort of cost, right? So they have the EE license, right? And you could definitely see like a pretty big enterprise just deploying Cal.com across their entire org and using it with like 10,000 employees and not having that much trouble like operating it. Mm-hmm. So it's more important for them to have that license to make sure that they don't get into a situation where someone's getting like a massive amount of value out of it and just never even come and giving you a phone call kind of thing. Mm. So that's that side of the protection.
So easier, it's more of an issue. If it's easier to deploy it, you might want
and scale,
then but if it's just very difficult, then that kind of is that's enough anyway.
Yeah.
It's not even difficult. It's difficulty crossed with like how mission critical it is. I think.
If something goes wrong, then they want they've got to handle it. Or
they also want they want to have someone to go to and be like, fix it.
Yeah.
Because we need this fixed now, and like also our customers now are going to sue us, and we want to be able to sue you if they sue us because something. Oops, I hit the microphone.
Yeah,
I was making a really good point there. So they might have customers who are going to sue them, and then they want to turn around and sue somebody else for causing that outage or something. So there's like when you get into that game of like big orgs and big enterprises and stuff, there's a lot of reasons they might, if you're mission critical, they might want to, have some kind of enterprise contract. Not like the license has nothing to do with that, obviously.
And there is like a different, so when people say open core, they mean like I think pretty much they mean one repo and it has like a mixed license like we just talked about. But there's kind of another version of open core, which is what we're doing, which is our repo is Apache 2 And self-hosters, so like medium scale, can just use us, self-hosters.
Yeah.
But like there's a lot of code that we have for the cloud product with some auto scaling and like other features, things like billing and stuff, which are in a private repo. And so you kind of need to think about like what code is where, is that code public or private, and under what license is it? And like what does that license or closedness like do for me? Because there are a lot of advantages to being more open, which we see. Like Apache 2, like developers absolutely love Apache 2 and they're our audience. And so you get self-hosters who basically become advocates for you. They talk about it on Twitter. We get most of our inbound is just organic, and it's because we're open source. And people choose us over our competitors because we're open source. Like largely. I mean, our model, like the kind of product is a lot more different now than our competitors than it was like a year ago. But open source is like a massive, massive reason that people choose us. So like when you're choosing a license, I think you need to also think, everyone focuses on the negatives of the license, like as in like the things protecting against.
Yeah.
But you also should think about the
defensive.
positives.
Yeah.
You should think about like, well, what if we had a more permissive license, would that actually allow us to like grow quicker? And it depends on your audience, I think.
It's also like, oh, what if Amazon comes and makes you compete? I'm like, yeah, you'd be doing pretty well, I think, if that happened. Like you'd already be at like a massive scale.
And I mean, it has happened, right? And people do change their licenses.
Right. But
obviously
like,
that's not ideal.
Yeah, it's exactly. But I think it's like a little bit like premature optimization, but for the license side of things. It's like, if you ever like get to that point, then that's a different question, and maybe, it'll become a problem then. But like the chances of you ever getting there are so slim.
Yeah, you've won. At that point, you have won.
Yeah, things are going well, and maybe that's not the biggest problem. Like bigger problems for us that we think about, like we never think about this stuff.
No.
Like we think about, lots of other things, like how we're going to keep the service like running well and like available. How do we keep delivering features that our users want? How do we, think about like scaling the team or not, and like things like that, or positioning. It's like not like, I think those like at this point, especially when you're just starting out, like I think just pick a license that you can be happy with, and that is like generally quite permissive, and just go with it. And if you are worried, or if anything starts changing, you can change it. I know that's sort of a controversial thing, but like it's not like when you choose a license, you have to keep that license for the rest of your life. So if you are one of those people who like all of a sudden now you need to do like the EE thing, you could do that. Obviously, then you'll have to suffer the consequences possibly.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's another conversation.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
We were at the YC like reunion, and we were talking to people about licenses, and we basically decided that we're going to keep our Apache 2 repo and put enterprise features in there, and we're just going to focus on having the separate like scalable private cloud like version repo, which is like kind of how we think about it, because we're just very attached to the idea of the Apache 2 license.
And I mean, it's like it's working pretty well for like Supabase, for example. Like they're Apache 2, and it doesn't seem to be like slowing them down. So I don't think like that the license. I think the license isn't gonna change anything, but you could choose like a license that could actually, like if you choose something that's like not open source enough, if you're a dev tool, it could harm you. Yeah. But I think the other way around, it's just more benefits than anything.
Well, just weird licenses. Yeah. Like people just choose like the weirdest stuff. Where you see like something with a license you haven't seen before. Like obviously that's going to be, I think that's like that's probably the worst decision you could make. Yeah. Is choose like a weird license, because if people don't understand it, they're probably not going to use you. And especially as you start to think about like bigger companies, they have legal departments, and those legal departments have now got to work really hard to figure out what this license means. And if there's any chance that they are worried about it, they're just not going to use you.
Yeah. Well, and they probably most likely just have a certain set of...
They have rules.
And they just If it's outside of that, then it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
Unless you're like really, really important for some reason. Yeah. Then they might have to then do another due diligence thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, our goal is to like spread throughout organizations in like a self-hosting. Like we would love if people self-hosted us.
Even if you weren't getting paid for that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because we think if what we've made is good enough, that it then gets into an organization and like a bunch of different teams are using us, even just separately. Imagine, like Apple, like there's how many teams do they have, and they deploy all sorts of stuff, right? So teams we hope they'll adopt us and run the self-hosted version and like get a lot of value out of it, like increasingly amount of value. And then at a certain point, they'll be like, well, we have all these like Trigger.dev installations everywhere. And like our developers love it. Like they love Trigger.dev, and they wouldn't like work if on something that wasn't Trigger.dev, for example. That's where we want to get. Because then the org is going to come to us and be like, can we please sign an enterprise contract? And then we don't have to do anything.
And their motivation for that would be what you mentioned previously, which is that they want someone to ring up at 3 a.m. and say, fix this.
Yeah, like support contracts, but also like kind of scaling, like we talked about.
Yeah.
Unification, I think. Like, so you take a bunch of different instances and you sort of put them all together in one, and then there's like efficiencies and all sorts of stuff.
Versioning is another big thing. Like especially at the moment, like the product moves very fast. Like we release major new versions, like bug fixes, and if you're self-hosting, obviously you have to upgrade. And usually that's like very seamless. And like we put a lot of effort into making it seamless. But whoever is like managing that instance still has to like actually do the upgrade. And
yeah, I mean, there's a reason. Like I've heard stories that ClickHouse is like quite. Well, some people say it's easy to run self-hosted, right?
Really?
But
people, like DevOps geniuses,
Okay. Yeah, cough baseline. But like they're still killing it on their cloud offering. Because people want like they think, well, ClickHouse will be able to run it much better than we will. And at a certain point, you just like, let's just use the people who know best about how to run it for us. Yeah.
Self-hosting, for us at least, self-hosting is definitely correlated with cloud growth as well. Like they just track like exactly. So like as the revenue for the cloud product goes up, like the number of self-hosters go up, and you can see it like very clearly in our Discord. And
do you think it's like the self-hosters are driving the cloud adoption, or is it?
I think, it's a complicated question.
Not yet, I don't think.
No. But some people self-host for a bit, and then they go, do you know what? I'm just going to use the cloud product.
Yeah.
Although some people use the cloud product just to get an idea and try it out.
Yeah.
And they like it, and then they self-host.
Yeah. So it works in both directions.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. And one of the other things that kind of when I was thinking about like the licenses, I realized there's a part that I didn't really understand very well, which was the copyleft concept.
It's very complicated.
Eric can definitely take this one.
Okay.
Well, what do you want to know specifically?
Well, I guess like the first thing is like, what is copyleft? What does it mean in general terms?
Yeah, so copyleft, I guess, is the sort of collection of licenses like GPL. So this GPL was like the first sort of copyleft license, and basically the gist of it is that if you use GPL code in a way where your code falls under like a quote unquote derivative work of the GPL code, then if you want to continue to use the GPL code without consequences, then you have to release your source code under the same license. So that's why it's called copyleft. And there's sort of the conception that it's like a viral license, right? Because like if I'm using like GPL code in my code base, then it's like forcing me to become GPL as well. And so the idea was the FSF, who created the license, basically wanted to like try to force companies who were using their open source code to also be open source or like contribute their modification. Like, so, because a lot of people were like taking some code and like modifying it and then trying to put it into their proprietary product and then shipping it and making money. So they want to encourage like more contributions, back to the community. And this is like their way of trying to do it. There's sort of a misconception where people think if you use say you're building something that's proprietary, like proprietary software, and you use some code that is GPL, some people think that means your code is like now GPL. Like it's almost like by law, it's like been infected with GPL.
I have to admit that is kind of what I was understanding when
pretty much everyone thinks so.
Yeah. So that's a misconception. The only thing it means is that if you're not following the conditions of the GPL license, then you don't have the copyright to the GPL code. And then the GPL code authors can bring a copyright infringement like suit against you. And they can sue for damages or an injunction to get you to stop, either pay or to stop using your code. There's no way in the law or anything to actually force code to become open source. The only forcing function is like you don't want to have this suit against you.
Yeah.
And so you might like settle, and part of the settlement is like, okay, well, we'll like open source this part of the code, or you could just stop using the code. But it's like there's no way there's no like nothing in the law that says like, oh, now my code is open source and I'm forced by the court to like distribute it, other than the fact that you might not want to have to pay the damages and stuff. But yeah, sort of a misconception that like you might accidentally like have to go and release your source code on GitHub. That's like not the case.
Okay, so like so let's say I make this like incredibly popular social network app and I'm using like an GPL library or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then my biggest competitor can't just come and say like, hey, you're using this GPL. It would have to be the creators that would.
Yeah, because it's the whole licensing regime is sort of under the copyright sort of law of whatever jurisdiction, right? So copyright isn't like some other person who had nothing to do with the copyrightable work can come and like say anything to you.
Yeah.
It's like the copyright owner can go and actually say. And it's funny how there's also like precedents where if the copyright owner says something publicly, like, actually, I know this is GPL, but I'm not going to actually enforce it, then they don't have any way of enforcing it. Like the court would see that as like them giving up the right to enforce it. Yeah.
So like even if they just said like, we're not going to enforce, like you're you're good to go at that point.
Yeah, you basically said that
Yeah.
it's not GPL anymore.
And there is like a lot of case law, isn't there, involved in this stuff, where stuff like, especially if you choose like a weirder license, obviously stuff does go to court at some point, and then those verdicts can impact like what their license means in the future.
But there's also like, there's a question of what falls under, like, how do you use the GPL code, and is your code then like using it in a way that the copyright holders could like take a case against you, like sue you, right? And that's very, very, very complicated. There's like, so GPL mostly is like if your derivative work, if you use it and like distribute it, and the way you distribute it is like through like software that's running on your computer. So there's like the quote unquote like SaaS loophole. So if you're like a SaaS and you use GPL code in your SaaS, and then people use your SaaS over the network, right? You're using your browser to like access, like Zapier, for example. So they could have something deep in their infrastructure, or whatever, that uses GPL, or maybe they take some GPL code, they modify it, and they put it in their code base, right?
Yeah.
But because they're a SaaS, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
So it's not distributed. So like in GPL's case, like distribution is like actually running a process on your computer. And then so when GPL 3 came out, because this was basically known for like a while, this loophole existed, and then GPL 3 came out
before any like online software existed.
Well,
right?
GPL 3 was 2007, and they were basically like, they wanted to close the SaaS loophole, but they didn't do it in GPL 3. They did an AGPL. And so they released AGPL is basically GPL 3 with the SaaS loophole closed. So if you want to write some code that then like people can't run a SaaS and use you, then that's the license that you'd want to pick. And so that's another way of like kind of protecting against. That's how MongoDB, for example, was licensed for a long time, because they were licensed under AGPL, and they basically as to like try to fight Amazon and stuff.
So that's what they use to
and people, it's very confusing. Like so it's people are very, very confused. So basically the confusion led to MongoDB, and actually this is like a feature of the license, is the confusion. It's led them to have like their dual licensing model. So you could use the AGPL MongoDB, but a lot of people were like, well, we don't know if like what we're doing is like will mean that they can have a copyright case against us. So we'll sign a commercial agreement with MongoDB, and then we know we're safe, we're covered. Yeah, so it's sort of a way of like forcing someone to come to the table and like sign a commercial agreement and pay you money.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But does it have, because I think we spoke about this, is it like if you're working with a big enterprise and you have GPL license, they would be, I guess that is the case, that they're not necessarily comfortable with that.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of people will shy away from using anything GPL unless they like know, like, okay, we're using GPL. It's a GPL 3. Like Linux is GPL 2, for example, and Amazon hosts Linux like servers and stuff, and it's not like that's not a problem. But I think there's a lot of different questions around it, like what is like if it's you might be only have to do it if you make like a modification. Or like what is using it is just calling like an API, like literally the question sometimes boils down to like, are you shelling out to call the code? Or are you like calling code from a statically linked library? Or are you calling it from a dynamically linked library? Like it's very, very confusing, and the questions are not settled, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like it leads to this like fear-based kind of regime where you're just like, I'm afraid of that license. I'm not going to touch it.
Yeah.
And that so when you think about like if we were to use some AGPL thing in our code base, it could not like kind of on the merits and on the like legal analysis of the situation, it shouldn't be a problem maybe for us to then like sell to some enterprise or something, or even for the enterprise to self-host us. But based on like the risk analysis, blah 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 stuff, like business case. In the real world, they might just be like, "No, we're not even going to consider that." So I think a lot of why we did Apache was like there is no fear. Yeah. Like we don't. It's just why would we put that like boundary up? Because I think we like at this point, any boundary is like why would you impose that on yourself?
Yeah.
Unless you very very specific reason. So I think if you don't know what that very specific reason is, it's probably just safer to choose a permissive license.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah,
so.
That's awesome. That was so good. That was like really like that was amazing. That was what is the book you
I have it.
You got it with you?
Mm.
Oh wow, let's do a shout out to the.
Well, you should. I mean, actually,
I should read it.
You should get Heather Meeker on that.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Yeah,
she's in that. She's in the cost community.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's the book there. It's pretty thick.
Show it sideways to see how thick it is.
And that's where I'm at. So I made pretty good work.
That's impressive.
It's a practical guide to open source software licensing. And practical, I think, is probably a good way to say, because when I first got the book, I was thinking it was like the layman's, understanding of it. It's like, no. That's definitely like you probably need to know some amount of law to like really understand this stuff, even in the book.
Yeah,
it's quite complicated. I mean, she does a really good job of like trying to make it understandable, but man, yeah, and a lot of things will kind of like circle back on each other and like, wait a minute, that was fine or that wasn't fine, and to parse all this stuff out is very complicated. So that's part of the reason why I think it's just like no one's gonna, especially users of an open source project, they're not gonna read this book, right?
Yeah, to
understand that they should use it. Mm-hmm. And so I think, it's safer just to choose something that people know, and then they don't have to think about like reading your book to figure it out. But Heather is literally the person who wrote like a bunch of the source available. So the things we haven't sort of talked about is like the source available licenses, and she's written a bunch of them. She's a lawyer in Silicon Valley, and she's like she goes way back in the whole like open source licensing movement. And so she's written these source available licenses like the one Mongo uses now, and the new one that Sentry came out with.
FSL.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, she was involved in that, I think.
Fair source license.
Yeah, the idea behind that is basically it's to protect against competitors, very like explicitly. For 2 years, when a piece of code is released, it's basically no competitor can use it. And then at that 2-year mark, it turns into Apache 2. So you can imagine it as like a rolling 2-year window that moves with the code. So like if I do a commit today, 2 years in the future, that commit will be available as Apache 2. But stuff that's in that like 2-year window is not.
And a lot of the source available licenses sort of they're trying, like the Elastic V2 one and stuff. They like, we don't want to limit self-hosters from using us. Like we don't. That is fine. Like we're really that's fine. But what we're trying to do is like not have Amazon come in or any of the cloud providers come in and just like, here's an Elasticsearch service, and we're going to make $1 billion a year, and then Elastic gets nothing, right? Yeah. So those source available licenses are very specifically trying to get that to not happen, but they're not technically like open source licenses. So they're like people. If you're like, oh, we're open, like if Elasticsearch was like, oh, we're open source, people would be like, no, you're not.
Yeah.
Because open source has a very specific meaning to some people.
Yeah.
It means like you have an open source approved license, which is not.
There aren't very many of them.
Yeah, it's like the GPLs and AGPLs and Apache and MIT and BSD and like there's a bunch more, LGPL and stuff. But yeah, there's like 100 that are actually open source, and then the source available like. And there's sort of this newer movement that's sort of like, I guess, done, or like they're not really as concerned with like the whole, because a lot of this originated in the 90s. Some of the people who are writing code now weren't alive in the 90s. So they're, a lot of it's like it's almost like post open source. So people would be, a lot of newer developers probably be like, there's sources available. Why can't you say open source? And it's on GitHub, and I can do pull requests, and I can, you know what I mean? It's like I can do every single thing I usually do with open source projects. So why aren't we allowed to call that open source? So there is this sort of like I think it's called like fair source or something like that. Yeah, it's like sort of people trying to rebrand some of that stuff to kind of cover it, because it is like a lot of it is just marketing, like or it's like that's what a lot of the concern comes down to, and you like trying to it's the whole Hacker News crowd thing, like. Yeah. Oh, well, now you've relicensed to something else, and now the Hacker News crowd's going to get you, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that's like sort of an interesting new area where I think the whole arguments about like GPL and versus Apache and all that stuff is sort of a little like older school, a little bit. It's starting to become a little bit like, and then there are some people who if you like, because you can run afoul of open source ethos so poorly that you are in trouble, like the recent YC company who unfortunately did some very bad things with an open source project. I won't say their name because I am terrible at pronouncing that word, but I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. But yeah, so I think it is still important to like it's important, even though there's sort of these newer licenses out there, to sort of know, what you're getting from like a marketing perspective, I guess, when you go with certain licenses. But.
Yeah, and I guess like you've pretty much already answered it, but I want to ask again, is like, why did you not look at like this like fair source license? FSL.
It didn't exist.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, it's like 6 months old or 9 months old or something.
Yeah, less. Yeah,
maybe
somewhere in there.
I think it's really interesting as a license, but it protects against competitors, and like I said earlier, it really depends on like what you're trying to protect against and what your product is. But that's not like a major concern for us.
Yeah.
Like we're not really worried about AWS offering like Trigger.dev as like a managed solution. And I mean, if it happens, then we're probably in quite a good place anyway. But FSL didn't exist.
But would you even be able to Coolify? I don't think could deploy us with that license. Right?
Yeah, so like some deployment platforms which make it easy to deploy self-hosted projects like Coolify, probably couldn't even use it.
Yeah, or it'd be like a confusion about whether they could use it.
Yeah,
and we don't. Why would we do that?
And some like commercial open source companies would see that as a feature of it, but for us, like we like self-hosters and we see that as like good for them obviously, but also good for like our growth.
Yeah.
And for like the health of the project as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what we're in the business of doing is like making developers happy and like giving developers tools that they want to use. So anything that gets in the way of that is a problem, I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, we want to have the most amount of developers using us as possible. It doesn't matter if they're using the cloud or the self-hosted version, because the idea is that, I mean, like, oh my gosh, it's such a problem that like we've spread so far and we have all like millions of developers using us self-hosted. Like that would be an insanely good outcome.
Yeah.
Because if you can't get to that outcome and not like benefit off of it, you know what I mean? Like if you get to that outcome where you have, imagine every TypeScript developer use us like that. And it would be, nothing bad would come from that, even if a bunch of people were using a self-hosted.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think DHH had like a really cool quote. I think there was this, in the WordPress drama, I think like Matt said, you're not I'm making $500 million a year. You're making like barely anything, even though he's not, he's making loads, but like you built Ruby on Rails and then Shopify and GitHub and all these like
all this stuff, and you didn't capture it.
Yeah, and he was like, "Well, I don't care. I'm happy that all this value was built on top of what I built. Even if I didn't get all the value.
That's a whole different.
Yeah,
maybe that's another.
So that was just. It was good. Like DHH was basically like, yeah, this just makes me sad. This is just it's like such a weird thing to attack someone for. It's like you've made an insanely popular like open source framework, and because huge companies were built on it, that's like an issue. It doesn't make any sense.
And also DHH is really rich.
Yeah, I mean, like, he's insanely wealthy.
So it's not like he lost in this situation. Like it's such a weird argument. I mean,
he races like $1 million like race cars for fun.
Yeah,
like,
and presumably crashes sometimes. So like,
I think he's
maybe he doesn't.
Right.
Maybe he never crashes.
I mean, I didn't think that came from Ruby on Rails, but
sure, but like.
But it did in a way.
Yeah, it did in a way because 37 Signals reputation, Basecamp or whatever they're called now is like from that.
Yeah, I somehow found that like, I don't know, if it was like sad, I was like, because I personally really like DHH, like I enjoy reading his stuff, and I just found it like quite sad to see someone like, completely dunking on all of his achievements even. It just felt like.
It was actually, it was a great advertisement.
Yeah, it was an advert for him.
You think?
Yeah.
It made DHH look amazing.
Yeah, I think it made him look really, really good.
Like,
Yeah, like developers look at that and go like, you are like DHH is amazing.
Yeah.
And I mean,
like,
let's be honest. He says a lot of other controversial stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was like, compared to Matt, DHH is like, is like a really nice, polite individual.
Also, like WordPress really dropped the ball. Like, first of all, like if you're not happy with open source, then don't make WordPress.
Yeah,
like it's very obviously like very open source, like the original thing. It's been used by like everyone, or like it's like 60% of the internet, something crazy. I don't know how reliable those numbers are. But like they could have built a good hosted version. Of WordPress, like a really good hosted version, and they didn't, and so. They could have made way, way more money by just building like a really good cloud product. And WP Engine is obviously, I mean, I haven't used it, but it's obviously better, I guess. So I think the story here is that like they dropped the ball and didn't build a good cloud product, and other people did.
Kind of win by being, I guess it's like you're saying, just like win by being really good. And then if you build the best thing and you're known as being the best thing, people are the dollars are gonna come your way, and everyone's gonna be happy about that because like you deserve it and you're doing it right and you're winning by like just being superior rather than like some kind of snakiness or something.
You have an enormous advantage at building the best cloud product if it's your product.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of baffling that you don't win in that situation. Yeah. And you hear
just from like reputation.
Well, reputation
should
alone,
win.
Yeah.
But I think WordPress is interesting because it's sort of like very established and probably like almost like a commodity, you know. So maybe that it's like done the innovation phase. Maybe I don't know. I'm not that much into that the WordPress scene, but it does seem like a lot of the concern about like WordPress stuff is like security related. Like they need security updates like every day, and if they like go 24 hours without needing a new like getting a security update, it's like a massive problem. Like that was the whole reasoning behind taking over like what was that secure
ACF
fields
or
thing or something?
SCF or something.
Because they couldn't tick the box. Remember that the sign in box where you say I'm not affiliated with WA. You couldn't log in if you were affiliated with WP Engine like financially or something. So the reason why it was taken over is because they couldn't log in to like update their plugin, and because there were security updates, like that was the reasoning. Yeah. Like, well, they can't log in and they can't apply these security updates, so we have to take it over, and so these security updates could be applied. And it was like 24 hours after they released the box. I'm like, how many security updates were there like in the last 24 hours? But anyways, that's just a whole messy situation. I don't even know what's the WordPress license.
I don't know, but it must be really permissive.
Yeah, it must be like MIT or something.
Yeah, but it's not good for open source when stuff like this happens.
No,
like it does. I mean, we obviously haven't felt any pain from this, but I think it does spread like mistrust in open source. Yeah. And obviously there are other things like Redis relicensing last year or whenever it was. Like it does make people a little bit more. People scrutinize open source more, which is maybe not a bad thing.
But also, like, it's not like the license is retroactive.
Yeah.
So the version that was released prior to that is still open source. Yeah. And can be forked and has been forked into Valkey.
Yeah.
And so worst case scenario, you like if something you're using is very popular, then you'll be able to use a fork.
Yeah.
And so that's like pretty good outcome.
Yeah.
It's not like. It's not like, oh my God, now the only way to use this is to pay.
Yeah.
Or you just keep using the version that had the license.
Yeah.
Like, well, we were happy with that. We don't need any of the new features. We'll just continue using the one that had the open source license.
Yeah, that's such a really good point. And I feel like there's a lot of, I feel like in particular right now, there's a lot of like backlash against like VC funded startups that are in open source and stuff. And I think like, that's a good argument that like, well, worst case, like a lot of VC dollars went to like fund this thing that's still completely open source. At some point, maybe they changed the license, but like it got really, really far and people could build on top of it. And like, I guess with like Terraform stuff. And
VCs are basically funding like a massive amount of like value given to the world.
Yeah.
Obviously depends on the open source license, but like I don't see that as a bad thing.
Yeah.
I think it's only a good outcome there.
Yeah.
Because it's not stopping other non-VC projects.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's plenty of those. And those probably the people who like us who want to create a startup. It's not like we would have been able to build Trigger.dev without some kind of financing.
Yeah. You need money to pay to live.
Yeah, it costs money to like the development, and so the alternative universe is not Trigger.dev exists, but it's like, I mean, it is Apache 2 anyway, but it's not VC funded.
Yeah.
The alternative is that it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And like obviously, like we certainly think this version's better.
Yeah, and I think like start like I know you guys well, like. You guys are amazing guys. Like you would always try and do like the best thing possible. And you have a business, but like that's not the only thing you care about. And I think that hopefully this conversation has shed a bit of light in that like, people are really trying, like open source startups are really trying to like do really cool stuff, make technology, improve the technology in the world, and also do believe in open source, and that's why you're doing it. It's not just like, like I think people say it as just marketing. It's not. Like, you guys care about it way more than that, and you believe in it. And it's like, I think a lot of open source startups are that way. So it's really cool to hear like how much you believe in it and what you're trying to do. I think we're actually out of time, but yeah, I don't know if there was anything else we wanted to talk about, but
Well, let me refer.
yeah.